folks, and welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Digest. My name, of course, is Dan Lizette, and this is episode 50, folks. Who would have thought I ever would have got this far? The big 5-0. Not quite a year yet. That's coming up on September 1st, but a couple of weeks of 2 episodes. Tips in the mail, right, guys? For this big episode, 5-0, I've got a very special guest. In fact, a little deviation from some of the guests you've heard in the past. The person I've got on my guest list today is not, at least currently, a podcast host. This is Devon Taylor. She is from the Timbre.com. This is a website all about podcasting, sort of if it was the Podcast Digest as a website 10 times better than what I'm doing. That is Devon Taylor. Devon, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
You are too kind, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me. And I've been a reader of the website, the Timbre, for a very long time and enjoyed what you guys are doing there and immediately felt a kinship in terms of what I'm doing and what you're doing. In fact, we've shared a lot of mutual interviews. But before we get into that, I want folks to get to know a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about your road to this website launch.
Well, it has been a circuitous one. I actually started out 10 years ago as an attorney and practiced law for 3 years. And ultimately, it really wasn't for me. And I ended up pursuing my dreams of writing. And I went back to grad school to be a writer. And, I've just always been in love with storytelling and narrative. And I don't really know why I was a lawyer in hindsight. But I met my business partner there, Eric McQuaid, and we both just love podcasts. And we found that we were talking about them constantly. And there's so much overlap between great narrative writing and great narrative podcasts. And ultimately, we had gotten to a point where we realized if we're going to be talking about this as much as we are, we really should be doing something with it. So about a year ago, actually a little less than a year ago, he made a comment to me that was essentially, why isn't there a website like AV Club or Grantland or Pitchfork that's just for podcasts? And we dug around a little bit and realized, sure enough, there isn't. And so why not be the reason why there is one? Why not start it ourselves? So here we are.
And it's an excellent website. Podcasters, podcast fans, if you're listening to this show, add it to your bookmark list right now because it is so much good information. If you're listening to me, it's because you want to find out about new shows. And this website is another excellent resource to be able to do that. So when you guys decided to fill this void that you're describing, sort of what was the envisionment? What was it that you guys thought that you might be able to accomplish?
Well, it started a little bit around the launch of Startup. And we found that we were talking so much, if your listeners aren't familiar, Startup's a podcast from Gimlet Media that kind of tracked the way that had launched. And it was a serialized podcast just about starting a business. And we were talking about it so much that we realized, and of course, Serial followed shortly thereafter. And we realized that if we were talking about it, and having as much interest, that other people probably were as well. And so our original vision was to do something that was akin to, I don't know if you're familiar, but AV Club does a lot of reviews and recaps of certain serialized television shows like Mad Men or, True Detective or what have you. And so we liked the idea of doing that. It's changed quite a bit since our original vision. We still have reviews. We do a weekly recap of what we think are just the best stuff out there for the week and kind of a listening guide if you don't have time to listen to everything. We do interviews. We do playlists. We do a news column. We really have kind of stretched in a lot of directions that weren't what we had originally envisioned, but just felt organic along the way.
And by and large, this production up to this point has primarily been just you and Eric, the two co-founders, right?
Oh, yes. Just us. And we're sort of laugh. We look back now and we're like, if we had known all the work, it felt like we'll just start a website. But it's really amazing how much it's grown, and it has just been the two of us.
So how have you guys sort of had the division of labor up to this point? Are one of you or the other specialists in certain areas versus the other, or is this just a co-effort on everything, or how does that work?
I would love to say that we had this really well-divided business plan that said, well, you're really strong with this, you're really strong with this. But a lot of it has just been ad hoc and figuring it out as we go. And we comfort ourselves a lot in reading different origin stories about websites. There was an interview on longform.org, which also has a podcast, which is excellent, with writers, with one of the founders of The Owl. And he talked about how you just figure it out as you go. And that's really been what we have done. We've just been figuring it out. And I've kind of taken on more of the editorial role in terms of the final product. He's really good with being a little bit of thinking outside the box and coming up with new ideas. But we really just support each other. And sometimes he'll have a great idea that I don't think is a great idea, or vice versa. And we push each other, and it makes the website better.
So you mentioned that there was an evolution that happened. So how did that evolution occur, Devon? Was it based on what you guys were satisfied with in the product that you were putting out? Was it based on reader feedback, or how did that evolution sort of track?
Well, we are two writers, and that means that we are probably neurotic, but at best really deeply analytical. And we made a decision very, very early on in this process to be as just absolutely thoughtful about every element of the business as possible. And that meant really trying to listen to people. And if somebody criticized something, not just get your back up about it, but really what does that mean? And so a lot of it has been listening, but it's also been a lot of instinct. The interview series, for instance, we do an interview series that's sort of an homage to the Paris Review. It's called The Art of Podcasting, and they have their art of fiction. So very, very clear homage to it. But we started that I think it was February, and it really grew out of the fact that we realized that so many of these hosts, and as much of what you're doing as well, so many of these hosts are beloved, but they're not well known. And there isn't enough coverage. And so rather than do a podcast, which we don't have your smooth, silky voice and and your production knowledge quite yet. So we just decided, let's do a long form written. We love reading long form written interviews. And if we love it, I guess that might be the biggest takeaway. If we love it, chances are good that somebody else does. And that might sound sort of, I don't know, it might seem kind of self-centered, or I don't know what it sounds like, but we trusted that instinct. And really that's the case. If you're interested in something, if you want to hear more about a person, or if you say, this podcast was interesting, I want to talk about it, other people do. There are a lot of podcast fans out there, and we're all hungering just to know a little bit more about this world. And by and large, we've trusted that instinct and been really receptive to feedback, and that's helped the site grow.
And I think that's the right instinct. And you and I have talked about this before, where the only thing you can do, right, if you're staying true to yourself and true to the message that you're putting out there, is relaying what you truly feel. So if you stand behind something or believe in something or are passionate about something, that's going to shine through. And to your point, there's more than likely an audience for it. And that's been one of the mantras that I've used in what I've put out here with the Podcast Digest, and it sounds like you guys have as well.
Well, and just to add to that, I think when you try to please everyone, you please no one. And that's true in really in everything, and certainly true in any kind of art. You end up with a watered down kind of corporate model that's just not offending anyone, but also not getting anyone excited. And I think one of the actually it's something that you just recently had Brian Koppelman on your show, and we'd recently done a long form interview with him, and he made the comment that when he was doing his show, he said, whatever I want to do, I'm going to do that as hard as I can, and not try to just kind of tiptoe around and, well, I'll give this person a little bit, and these people that kind of want this, I'm going to just double down on exactly what my instincts are. And that's really that's the best advice I feel like you can have with almost any endeavor, and it's certainly been true with the site thus far.
I think it's definitely great advice. And you mentioned Brian, and he was a joy to talk to. And you mentioned your interview series, and the website's laid out very nice. My compliments on the website. Very clean, very well organized, easy to find stuff. All the tabs at the top, folks, when you go and visit it, you will find all types of different content that you will be interested in if you're listening to this show as a podcast fan. On the interview tab are these, at the time of the recording, 22 of that Art of Podcasting series that you were referring to. And I wanted to talk about that because I think I was going through and trying to get a count quickly. I just thought about this right before we hopped online. I think we've shared 4 or 5 guests at this point, Brian being one of them, Phoebe Judge, Alex Goldman, a couple others. But what's interesting to me, and that I would like you to talk about a little bit, because this is a question I get often. And if I'm getting it, I imagine when folks go and check out the site, if they haven't already, and I'm imagining several listening already have, is I get this in terms of, how do you find these guests? What is the process for reaching out to these people and getting them to agree to talk to you? Talk about it from the Timbre's perspective. What has this process been like for you guys?
Well, it wasn't something, like I said, that wasn't something we'd originally envisioned as part of the site. But we found that very early on, we'd expected or hoped really that if we were to gain any kind of traction, it would be with podcast fans first and foremost. That made the most sense to us. And very quickly, we noticed that industry people, podcasters and producers, were the ones that were coming to our site and talking about what we were putting out there. And that really surprised us. It certainly delighted us, but it was very surprising. And it also offered us access to these fascinating, brilliant people. And it felt like that was something that we shouldn't pass up. One of our very first interview was with PJ Vogt, and that was, he hosts or co-hosts Reply All on Gimlet. And that was by no means a coincidence, because he was the very first person who took notice of our site. And I will never forget it. He now it sort of seems silly, but he tweeted out something on Twitter, obviously, about our website and how much he was enjoying it. And immediately, we had like 4 followers on Twitter. This was like January 1st. We had just launched. And we had like 4 followers on Twitter. We were seeing no traffic. And immediately those numbers spiked. And so we were very, very appreciative of the fact that he took notice. But we also realized, like, there's a much shorter distance between us and these people than we really expected. These are people who are maybe not getting as much attention, although that's very rapidly changing, as they should. And they're people who are very, very intelligent and very interesting. So as far as the decision, I mean, I'm sort of straying from your original question. That was the vision in terms of the actual podcast interview series. In determining what guests to have, there are so many out there. I mean, I swear it's like they're willing for the most part to talk. They're very generous with their time. And we try to choose people that both are high profile and well known, and also people that are upcoming and whose shows we really like, or who could be maybe a new budding podcaster might really identify with their struggles. We try to really span the gamut in terms of the kinds of people that we interview, all of whom we really admire, but who are at different points in their career.
So that's going to lead me directly into the next question, because if we don't cover this, Devon, there are going to be any number of people who are going to bombard you and Eric, and they probably already have, but after hearing this conversation, there'll be more. And I imagine you guys probably get it to the nth degree, the same type of experience I have with those who would just love to be featured on the website. And it's the same experience I have. And recently what I did, and most of my listeners and followers on Twitter know, is that I ended up setting up a Google form on my website saying, if you've got something you'd like me to check out, submit it here. And now I have this running list that is sort of my repository of things that my listeners and followers would like me to go check out. And I'm working through it and, scroll through and find something I like. And then I move from there. That's been my little tool that I've come up with to kind of handle the bombardment. From you and Eric's perspective with the Timbre, how have you guys managed this issue?
I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up, because it is one of the most difficult things. And I don't mean because, oh, gee, we have so much email, how will we ever do this? But what I mean is, To some degree, sure, when you get a lot of emails, it's difficult. But at the same time, there are a lot of great shows out there that no one knows about, and they need to be discovered. So you try to find that fine line between encouraging people to email, and we want people to email. We want to find these shows, but also, of course, you make those lists and you say, okay, I'm going to get to that, and you might not be able to get back to everybody. But we found a number of shows. One of them, or actually we found a producer. One of them was an Australian producer named Sharon Davis, who has been at it for a long time, and she has produced some unbelievable segments and documentaries, and she's won a number of awards. She's certainly not unknown, but not known she's not a household name, we'll say. And she contacted us, and it was a very nice email, and she just said, hey, I like your site. You might be interested in what I'm doing. Here's a few links, and if you are, I welcome further communication. And if you're not, best of luck to you, which is a perfect email, right? Because you say, all right, I will check you out. And sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes you're just at that moment you can click and listen. And other times it's weeks later because you're buried. But we ended up just falling in love with her work, and we featured her on the website in our Art of Podcasting series. And anytime, we've got a really just open line of communication between us. Anytime she's got something new coming out, we want to know about it, because the biggest issue in the podcasting world, as you're well aware, and I'm sure your listeners are well aware, is that it's really hard to find new stuff. It's a very opaque world. And that's something we're trying very hard to solve and help. But it really has to be done in this sort of guerrilla, not gorilla, like gorilla GUE, not in the zoo gorilla, but in this guerrilla manner of just one show at a time. And that's really a shame, but there's something nice about being able to help those people that are wonderfully talented and are reaching out and saying, hey, check out my work. You don't want to get harassed, but I think it's perfectly acceptable and wonderful to reach out and say, hey, I'm doing something, you might like it.
So when talking about the best stuff that's out there, one of the coolest things that your site has is the Monday morning or Monday postmortems, right? I shouldn't say morning, right? The Monday issued postmortems. And you've done these for, if I'm looking at it correctly, 31 weeks. Maybe by the time someone's listening to this, it'll be 32 or beyond. So let's talk about that, because one, I know from just following you guys on Twitter for many, many months that this is a huge conversation piece in terms of people who see this come out and what's included and what's not included and so on and so forth. I imagine it's one of the features of the website that gets a lot of feedback. Tell me about how this idea came about, sort of, and also kind of segue into how in the world do you put this together?
Well, the postmortem is our weekly guide to the best podcasts, and it is divided into 3 sections: the best in show, runner-up, and honorable mention. I think we were just sort of having fun with that, probably thinking of the film Best in Show to some degree. But that is actually one of the very first features of our site, if not the very first feature of our site. It is meant to be a guide of what is out there in the past week and what is good and what people should pay attention to. And it is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it is meant for people who maybe don't have time to listen to as many shows as we do, to take a stab at a new show they might not have known about, or to listen to something that they pay attention to, but they don't tune in every week. Oh, there's a good new episode of this show. Let me jump on board. And the way that's put together ain't sexy. It is a lot of listening, a lot. I mean, it's just, I wish I could say we have this like team of listeners that just like these little bots that just with headphones on.
You and me both, Devon.
Oh my God. There's no quick way to do it at all. And you can't shortcut. There are so many shows that maybe we've never even featured, but that we know are going to find their footing, or they're going to have a great week, or they're just consistently really enjoyable that we still listen to. And you want to find a good variety so that it's not all just storytelling, it's not all interviews, it's not all fiction or nonfiction or whatever. You want to get a nice variety. You don't want to include the same shows every week. So that requires hours of listening. And Eric and I have a pretty good division of labor when it comes to that. You asked earlier about our division of labor. That's probably the one thing that we've really ironed out. There is some overlap, and we will often say, hey, I kind of liked this show, or I think this one's sort of interesting. Will you take a listen? And we just trust each other so much when it comes to that editorial ear, I guess. So we'll have certain shows that we're the only one who's listening to that we're like, oh, this is kind of interesting. I want to follow this one for a while. But truly, Dan, we're subscribed to upwards of 250 shows, and they don't come out every week, thank God, because we probably would be insane by now. But we are just trying as hard as we can to listen to everything. And because it's fair, people are putting work into these shows, and just because one show might be consistently good does not mean that another show that maybe somebody doesn't have as big a budget for, doesn't have as much experience, it doesn't mean that it won't be outstanding one week. And they deserve credit for that. And we try to crowdsource in terms of recommendations, but it's really just, there's no way to do it other than put those earbuds in your ear, and everything you do that you can listen to shows during, whether it's walking to the store or doing dishes or what have you, you just listen to shows.
So the division of labor with you and Eric, I'm envisioning you have all shows A through L. I have all shows M through Z. Is that something like that?
No, it's really more like there are certain shows that I think we know the other one prefers a little bit, or that we're just naturally drawn to. Eric is probably a little bit more of a I call him Robot Boy. He loves facts. He loves strategy. He's the guy who's going to listen to Planet Money or Freakonomics the second it drops. So I just know those are I don't need to listen to those unless he says, hey, this is a really good episode. Let me get your feedback on it. Whereas he knows I have certain shows that I love. And beyond that, we just communicate a lot during the week. Hey, I listened to this. I mean, it's a lot during the week, a lot during the day. We talk 80 times a day. He's actually in Memphis right now, but he will be in Denver in a couple of months, and that will make it a lot easier. But there's a lot of communication, and then generally when Saturday hits, we compare notes on what we've listened to, what we liked, what still needs to be heard, and the weekend just sort of turns into a marathon of listening to make sure every last stone is turned over, and we've given every show that we can a fair shake.
Back in some of my older episodes, before I started bringing on guests, I used to have this listener discussion segment that I would open my show with. And one time I had somebody on and we were doing show recommendations, and we discussed the concept of listening speed. With the type of subscriptions and plowing through of listening that you guys are doing, are you guys pro or con, for or against anything other than 1x?
Nope, we are con. I think the production value is so important. And some of those, even if it's just an interview, those pauses, the delivery, they're just as important. It would be more efficient, but I think something would be lost in translation, and we think they should be appreciated the way they were created.
I happen to agree, and that was the position I took during that discussion as well. I am a Pocket Cash user. I've advertised that many times. They are not a sponsor, although I would take it. But I do flirt around with 1.1, 1.2 sometimes because they allow that interval, and it doesn't, in my opinion, affect it to any significant degree, much more than that, and I feel the effect, and I have to drop it back. So I'm with you. I'm not a fan of 1.5, 2x, or even in Overcast on iOS, the smart speed thing, and I've tried it so many times I cannot just get into it at all.
Dan, you want to hear an awful confession? Both Eric and I still use the original iPhone app for podcasts.
No, in fact, that's not a bad thing or horrible. In fact, and I'm sure being as attentive to the subject matter as you guys are. Stats have come out, and Libsyn talks about it all the time, that 67% of downloads are to iOS devices, and of those, 80+% of those are using Apple's podcast application. It's the standard fare. It's where most people are listening.
It's so clunky. I mean, Apple's probably not going to come and sponsor our website after this conversation, but they weren't knocking yet anyway. But it's really clunky. It's difficult. You can't alphabetize things. If you don't listen to a show every single time it comes out after like 2 episodes, it'll stop automatically updating. Yeah. I mean, it's just got so many things that drive us insane, but it's what we know. Right.
And I've got my own qualms with it as well. And, one of the things is that you import a new subscription. And I don't know if this is still the case, as I've only tried it back a couple of times. But I just had this because I told myself I'm going to take another look again, because I know so many people are listening and I want to do what my listeners are doing. And so I want to make sure I'm familiar. For some reason, I added this show in, and it insisted on it. It used to do this, and I thought this was fixed. Take every back episode and mark it unread.
Oh,
so one of the shows,
overwhelming.
It was horrible. See, I'm a big tech guy, as anyone who listens to this show knows. And actually, one of the shows I featured on my very first episode is called The Cell Phone Junkie. The Cell Phone Junkie, Mickey Papillon, Joey Coppas, they do great work over there. They have over 450 episodes. It's been around forever. A great show about mobile technology. Podcast app decided that it was going to mark 450 episodes unread.
And a lot of them download. Like one thing I like about the iOS app is that it just streams, and all of those other apps, or most of those other apps, download. So you had 450 downloaded apps.
And I had to go, and the way you have to do it is you have to hold on each one, check all the boxes next to them, and then the screen refreshes, check the next batch of 8 or whatever. And I went through them all just because I said I just don't want to deal with this again. But so anyone looking for an alternative app, Apple's podcast app is fine, but if it has ever irritated you in any way, I personally am a big Pocket Cast fan. I love it. It's on Android. It's on the web. It's on iOS. It actually syncs between all of them. You listen to a show. I have an Android tablet. Hate it, but I have it. I can listen on my iPhone, watch an episode, get deleted after it's played, and I can watch it disappear from my Android tablet. There's no other app that's going to do that for you. And
try it. I have it downloaded. I'm old and set in my ways.
And it's excellent, too, because you actually create an online profile. And when you do, so let's say you replace your phone, the new iPhones come out or whatever the case may be. You grab that, you download the app, you sign in with your email and password, boom, everything's right back where you left it. It's wonderful.
All right. I'll give it a shot. I trust you, Dan.
All right. The ad is done.
Native advertising here.
Yeah. So let's move on to other parts of the website. There are other things that you guys have got going on here. Tell folks about some of the other things that you guys have. There's some of these kind of editorial essay style things, and I'm probably not categorizing that right, but there's some really interesting ones, and you've gotten some big response on some versus the others. What is that section of the website about?
Well, so we actually, the difference probably only matters to us, but we have both essays and what we once upon a time called deep dives, and then we realized that we were being way too cutesy and just changed to reviews. So we will have individual episode or individual show reviews. It used to be episodic, and that just didn't really make sense, so we switched to show reviews. And so we'll have a review, like we just recently published one from actually a freelance writer, and it was a review of Mystery Show. And so that's formerly known as Deep Dive, now just a review. And it's just a discussion of the show. It was a very positive review. We really love Mystery Show, another Gimlet show. They're getting a lot of credit on this in this conversation. But we also will do essays. And the essays are a little bit harder to characterize. They're commentaries on either, let me see if I can do this. They're commentaries either on the on trends that we're seeing in podcasts and podcasting, on the actual material, the actual content, or they may be changes in the industry, or they are meant to be a little bit more of, I guess, contemplative about what podcasts mean. And those have been, I mean, both of these we would love to be writing so many more of. They take a lot of time. We are nerdy writers who probably put too much time into our writing and pour over it and demand excellence from one another, which doesn't mean that the material is necessarily excellent, but we push each other hard. And those don't come out as often. It's something that if we're able to do this full time, or as the website grows, we'll probably become more of a staple. But right now are kind of little treats that pop up, every couple of weeks. And we've gotten a lot of, one thing that we encourage a lot is for freelance writers, like I'd mentioned earlier, to email submissions, just fully written submissions. We no longer do the pitch style. That just became problematic. But send us an essay, send us a review that you've written. And we don't work with revisions because we just don't have the time. But if it's something that fits what we're doing, and we're not the arbiters of quality, but just kind of fits our site aesthetic and voice, we love featuring that stuff. And so we've had a lot of success with that, and that's been able to add some content and add some different voices. It shouldn't just be Eric and I. We love it and we spend a lot of time thinking about it, but there are many intelligent and thoughtful writers and readers out there that should be chiming in on this topic. So we've been able to feature some of that, and that's been a real delight for the site.
And those have been some of the most interesting things that I've read on the site as well, because there's definitely a personality, there's definitely a perspective taken in each one of those essays, and it is a very refreshing read, as the deviation from the postmortems or the interviews or what have you. So definitely, folks, check that section out as well. I think you're going to find some really interesting conversation starters, let's call them, coming out of some of those essays as well.
You are too kind, Dan. Thanks so much.
I want to hop back for a second because I kind of passed over something that I think folks are going to want to hear about. I want to hear about because it's one of the same things. Again, I share a kinship with you and Eric in terms of a lot of these same challenges. You mentioned all the shows you're subscribed to. How do you find them? How do you determine what to hit the subscribe button on?
Well, we talked about people emailing, and honest to God, that's a huge, huge, huge part of how we find shows. I'm picturing a deluge of emails.
I was going to say, you've done it now.
What am I doing? But sometimes people that email, and I'm going to be perfectly candid about this, sometimes it's really clear that they don't follow the show, or that follow the site, I'm sorry, because their shows just don't fit in the aesthetic that we cover. We haven't really branched into comedy. We don't have the resources for it. We've stuck pretty strictly to narrative shows, and that has helped us. I mean, in answer to your question, in terms of how you find the shows, that's helped a lot, having a focus. There are a zillion podcasts out there. There are a zillion. That's the actual figure.
Yes.
And if you were to say, I'm going to listen to every podcast that's good, especially when it comes to comedy podcasts, you couldn't do it because some of those are hours long. And so we decided pretty early on that we were going to focus on narrative, which is a little bit of a broad term in the way that we use it, because it's not straight storytelling. We'll do interview shows. We'll do shows that are a little bit, even they might, we'll cover Mark Maron, and he would be considered a comedy show. But that allowed us both to focus that list, but it also allowed us to bring what we felt like was our best skills to it. I mean, we're writers. We know narrative. We've studied it. We've spent a long time writing and reading, and we both worked on literary journals, and that felt like our best strength. So as far as finding shows that aren't recommended to us, sometimes, honest to God, it's just going through that awful iTunes list and just looking at descriptions, reading reviews, and saying, well, that sounds kind of interesting. It's so imperfect. It really is so imperfect. There are, I'm certain, so many shows out there that aren't getting the listenership that they should. And that's really disappointing for them and for us. But we are doing our best to hunt them down. And if they email us and say, hey, I've got a show, I think you might like it. Here's what it's about. Check it out. We always check it out. We might not respond to the email because we don't have the time, but we always check it out. And otherwise, it's just a flashlight in the dark looking. Really, that's it.
Let me ask.
What do you do?
A lot of the same thing, right? I mentioned the forms that I've got. So now my website can actually be a formalized vehicle for receiving them, because probably like you, I was getting emails. I was getting @mentions on Twitter. I was getting Facebook comments. I was getting, everything but a text message at this point with somebody asking me, how do I get on your show? How do I get reviewed by you? Please check us out. Da, 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 da. And all of that is great. And I echo your sentiments. I want that stuff because it's almost like being, personally served discovery, which for the average listener, if you will, no, did not mean that in any wrong sense here. But for anybody who's the average podcast listener, nobody's serving them directly. They're going to see the charts, right? They're going to see the maybe one of their friends on Facebook or Twitter may come forward and say something, or maybe through a site like yours. But they have to go and find almost all of those things, where we're in the fortunate position where people are telling us, hey, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. Now, you guys being two people, me being one person, you need some kind of, like you said, you may not always reply due to time constraints, or it may not ultimately get featured because it doesn't fit the aesthetic. I'm exactly the same way. I mean, the Podcast Digest is very much like that. That aesthetic is my voice. And, and that's sort of the best you can do.
It is the best you can do. It's so imperfect, and it feels, I probably get more stressed out about it than Eric does. He's pretty level-headed, and I because we both come from a writing background, and we know all too well all the talent that's out there in any artistic industry and how often it goes unnoticed. And that's really frustrating. And I want to be, I'm like justice oriented. These people should get their, should get their audience, or they should be heard. And it doesn't always work out that way. And that's really, especially, sometimes, and let's just say it, sometimes there is someone that thinks having a podcast is as simple as plugging in a microphone and saying, listen to me, aren't I hilarious or insightful or whatever? And sometimes they are, and that's great, but rarely are they. And more often, it's the people I'm talking about are the people that are spending a lot of time editing, and they're thinking about craft, and they're working hard on production, and they recognize that everything that spills out of their mouth isn't going to be the most fascinating thing that's ever been said, but they're paying attention to what they like, or what people like, or what makes for art. And those are the people that I get, that keep me up at night thinking that they're out there toiling away with their DIY equipment in their closets, making great stuff and not finding an audience. It really keeps me awake.
You're absolutely correct. I couldn't agree more, and that's actually something that I've also said as well in the past for folks. There's a lot of people who will ask me to feature them or review their show, and I may check it out. And when I do, I'm like, I don't like this, or it's no good, or the sound quality is horrific, or the content is not up my alley. And if that happens, that's okay. There may be an audience out there for you. There may be some people who are listening to it and enjoying it. Work with those guys, because that may not necessarily be something that I want to feature on my product. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily, stay the path. But constantly ask yourself, is there something more you can do? Is there, more that you could put forward? Libsyn, who I host with, most people know, put on Twitter just I think it was just yesterday, which is probably 4 or 5 days ago at the time of this recording. They asked a question about, somebody who is just starting podcasting today, what would you tell them? And I said something to the effect of, I replied to them and I said, well, here's my quote. I said, it's okay to fail. At first, nobody's listening anyways. I said, don't get discouraged and work hard to get better. It's a process. And that's what I've found is that, everything, you talked about it with the Timbre's evolution since you guys launched, that there was an ad hoc process for evolving it into what it is today. And it's just a matter of sort of catching these shows as people who want to highlight those who may not yet have the attention that we feel they deserve at the right time when they're on that upswing. And hopefully, maybe, just maybe, your website or what I've got going on here provides them somewhat of a platform for the jumpstart that they deserve.
Well, absolutely. And I think that something I think about a lot, obviously you have gained a listenership, so your recommendations are, they're appreciated and they're enjoyed. People keep coming back. They like the show. And we've been able to gain traction in terms of readers. And so there's something to be said for, okay, we're doing something right. But at the end of the day, and it sort of has blown my mind from an editorial standpoint. At the end of the day, this show, your show, is Dan Lizette, and our site is Eric and Devon. And it makes you realize that for every editorial or critical website or podcast, there are people behind it, and those people have their own tastes, and you just might not share them. And so sometimes someone will send us something and it's not for us, or they might send you something and it's not for you. And that we're not the final word on the quality. We've been fortunate because people do seem to like a lot of what we've featured, and so we're doing something right. But I'm always aware of the fact that you can get just a little too high and mighty on being this, like, we're the deciders, right. And we're just not. I don't know. I think it's important to remember.
No, I agree, and I do want to move on to another subject, but before we leave this one, I want to hit one more tone on here, because I've said this before, and every time I do, I feel bad about saying it, but I want to tell you, and then you tell me if I'm crazy or if you know where I'm coming from, and maybe if you and Eric feel similarly. Whereas what I'm trying to do here is to make sure that I am putting out what I feel are some of the best things I've found for people to listen to, that I think they will enjoy if they want to try something different or something that isn't getting highlighted enough, and shine the light on somebody who I think is doing great work. What I'm not there to do is to be somebody's free marketing or promotional machine. And getting bombarded by all those people. I'm not just here to raise your show up because you have a show, right? And sometimes I've said that before in previous episodes, and I've caught crap from people. They've said, "Well, fine then I just, I guess I won't tell you to listen to my stuff then." And the concept here is it's not that. It's that because this is my goal does not mean I can highlight every show that probably needs more listeners or every host that's doing a great job. But by the same token, I'm not just here for your promotion. I understand by having you on or by featuring you, you might get a few more downloads. And that's great because that's exactly what I want to have happen. But don't look at me as a free marketing tool.
Yeah, I'm giving the positive spin on that whole idea, saying like, hey, there's some great stuff that's out there and it should be featured, etc. And I mean that. It's very genuine. But that is not to say that I don't get completely frustrated by some of the emails that we get or some of the reception in terms of, well, I sent you this, or hello, like, why haven't you responded, or something. It's really hard. I think that people should promote their work, because what are they going to do? That's all you've got. But at the same time, there are so many reasons why your work might not be gaining traction. It might be bad luck. Sure. It might be that it's not there yet. It might be that you just don't, have enough overlap in terms of what your interests are with somebody else's. There are so many reasons. And I totally agree with you that people in any art form need to be aware of the fact that promotion is good, but entitlement is not. And
exactly.
It's true for all of us.
You're right.
You and me, like, you're pushing your show. You want to get more listeners, but if you don't get them, I can't imagine. And I don't know you well, but I know you a little well. I can't imagine that you sit around feeling self-righteous about it.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing, right? Is that if the concept is do good work and people will notice it, that's sort of been my mantra, right? If I feel as if I put out a good product, that the content itself is your best promotion. I've always believed that, and I've said that on other shows I've been a guest on, that my best promotion is not what I do on Twitter, because I can get a little aggressive with that. It's not about what I put on Facebook, because there's a lot of posts there too, and it's not the links I send out. What my best promotion is, when somebody does come, it's how do they come back, right?
Yeah.
If I go to your website and I find a really interesting essay, or I really like that Monday thing, oh, they're out every Monday. If I enjoy what's happening, I'm likely to come back. It's not going to be because you emailed me 15 times that week and reminder, check it out. That's not how you're going to drive traffic. You're going to drive traffic because they like what's on your site. Am I crazy, or am I making sense?
No, you are. You're right. I mean, I think for every artist out there that dies in obscurity and later they're famous, which for some reason is not jumping to mind. I'm not sure why, but we'll say F. Scott Fitzgerald, because it's certainly somewhat true for at least Gatsby. But for every one of those, there are many that the reason that they're not gaining traction is because the quality isn't there. And so harassing somebody to feature them isn't going to solve that quality problem. Right. And I totally agree. I mean, listen, your listeners might come to my website and say, this is garbage, I don't like it. And I hope they don't. We put a lot of time and thought into it and we work hard on it. But if they feel that way, that's it. That's the buck stops with the experience of enjoying or consuming the media, whether it's your podcast or it's our website. No amount of harassment or emails or whatever is going to change the ultimate experience of how you interact with that material.
Absolutely. I'll close the book on that. My feet are nice and clean from standing on that soapbox. Accept my apologies, folks.
We were having this lovely sort of probably kind of Pollyanna conversation, and then I'm like, hey, you better get your quality better, or screw you.
Well, and you know what I hope folks take away from that back and forth is what made me think of this, Devon, was when you said, there are real people behind that. Right. And understand that yes, there's the website and yes, there's the show, but behind that are just a couple of people, and we're real people. And, there's no reason to be self-righteous or, flippant in your interactions. And hopefully that will bring some civility to the things for 48 hours.
I'm going to add one thing to it. I know we've just gone on and on about this. I'm going to say, I know that I think you don't currently have sponsors on your show.
No. And
we don't have sponsors on our website, which is slightly a choice, slightly just a matter of the numbers. But at the end of the day, and this isn't woe is me, but at the end of the day, we're people that are doing this because we love it. And I'm not saying, oh, look at us volunteering our time, feel bad for us. But
right.
I mean, this is something that's a labor of love. And for all of us. And so I just think that's a factor. I don't know what conclusion to draw from that, but I think it's something that listeners and readers should remember. We're doing this because we love it too.
Speaking of readers, segue on to the next topic. I'm curious. So take us from sort of the initial launch up to recent days. What has the reception been to the site as a whole?
It's really been amazing. I am by no means an expert on what traffic should be or could be, but from what I have read, it's been really you mentioned our website that you liked the design. It was designed by Buzzworthy Studio, and they're based out of New York, and they're very kind and provide us a lot of support, and they support our analytics, and they're constantly saying, hey, great job on that, or hey, you had a big day. So I think the traffic has been good, and we're not the New York Times.com quite yet, but it's been a really positive reception, and I think the biggest takeaway is that it's growing. It's growing every single month, and that's really, I think Eric and I both get so impatient sometimes because we just want to do this full time, and then we'll talk to the crew over at Buzzworthy, and they'll say, where you are after 8 months or 6 months is just where you need to be. So I know that's a little bit cryptic, but let's just say we're pleased.
So the ultimate goal here is ultimately to make the Timbre a full-time enterprise.
It's actually world domination.
Okay, goal 1A.
1A is world domination. 1B, or let's just say 2. We have a lot of ideas, some of which I'm willing to share, some I'm going to keep close to my vest. One thing that we really want to do, and Eric has pushed very hard for this, and I'm willing to go on the record about it, is that we'd like to develop a narrative podcast ourselves. And that's something that's in the works. I don't know where we're finding the time of the day for it, but if there's if there's a trust fund lying around that I haven't discovered, that would be helpful. But we would like to do that. We would like to feature more writers. We would love to cover more shows. We would love our website to be the place that you go if you love podcasts, and you can interact on a casual level and just, grab that Monday postmortem, say, oh, I'm going to listen to those couple shows. They sound interesting. Or you can just geek out on it on a daily basis. That would be fabulous. But we have bigger plans.
Well, I encourage everyone who's listening to this to get on the bandwagon now to see what will be coming down the pike, because if you guys are able to pull off any of these ideas that you mentioned, especially your own podcast, I was just trying to figure this out in my head. Okay, if you guys launched a podcast, then what I could do on my podcast is review your podcast that is from a website that reviews other podcasts.
Oh,
it'd be like triple meta or something to that effect.
We're all just sitting around staring at each other.
Well, and then when I'm done with that, then I could start a podcast about that experience.
Absolutely. we'll write a review on our website of your podcast.
There you go. Look at that. It should be fun. It'd be a new tab on the website.
I should tell readers, because God, I look back and I think, I thought the word timbre was really well known when we started this. It's actually spelled Timbre. So it's the timbre, and often people pronounce it timber, which is no problem. If they're saying the name of our website, we're happy. But it's technically pronounced timbre, but it's nonetheless spelled with an I, and it's R-E.
And that link will definitely be in the show notes. Before we go, though, you and I had talked about, in the grand tradition of the Timbre and also the Podcast Digest, that maybe we should talk about a couple of shows that we like.
Oh, we like so many shows.
That would make sense, right? Wouldn't it make sense, with you and I chatting, that we chat about a few of the podcasts that we like? So why don't you go first?
All right, I will jump in. Well, one show that we are very bullish on, that's a word that Eric taught me, very stock markety, that we're really bullish on, that we really love, is Home of the Brave, which is a show from NPR public radio legend Scott Carrier. It's a show, I guess you could say, about America, but it's really a show about just a little bit of what it means to be a person. It's a lot of personal essay style, in the sense that maybe one episode will feature him going on on a river, like on a boat down the river, and, or a canoe down the river, and meeting people and just talking to them. Or he might have, he actually traveled to Nepal to interview people after the earthquake and subsequent avalanche. He covers a lot of things. I guess the biggest takeaway from his show is he gives voice to a lot of people who don't have a voice, but he's a legend in the world of radio. He's been on This American Life. He used to be on NPR really regularly. He's incredibly talented, and you will follow his voice anywhere, I promise. So if your listeners don't know about the show, they will fall in love with it. And if they do, he's somebody who his whole story is that once upon a time he hitchhiked. I think it was like 1982 or 83. He was just a budding documentarian, and he hitchhiked to the steps of NPR in DC and recorded tape along the way, and got there and said, "Hey, take a listen." And they kind of laughed at him, and then he had a job. So he's really tremendously talented, and everyone should be hearing him.
Well, and that link will definitely be in the show notes. And we talked about these before, and I mentioned they were all new to me, and they've not been featured on the Podcast Digest before. But as I've heard your description of that, I think I've heard an episode or two of Home of the Brave. Now I'm going to have to go look myself.
He was featured on This American Life a few weeks ago, too, or a couple months ago. So that might
that could be. Okay, I'll take a turn. I've got one that has yet to be featured on the Podcast Digest, and I'm doing this a little bit off the hip. So I'm going to stick with ones that I know really well and ones that are maybe, and that's one of the things, folks. If you're listening to this show and you like the Podcast Digest, this is why I wanted to talk to Devon, is because while we're sort of in the same market, if you will, we come from very different places. I've featured a lot of stuff that has not been featured on the Timbre, and the Timbre has a lot of things that have not been featured on the Podcast Digest. So I really think they're kind of complementary products in the sense of getting a nice, huge swath of great stuff that's out there. So I say that as a preface for what I'm about to talk about, because it's completely different. That's a show called Analog from Relay FM. As I mentioned before, big tech fan. Relay FM features mostly tech-based shows. Analog is one, though, that's a little bit different. This is hosted by Mike Hurley, previous guest on the Podcast Digest, and Casey Liss, who is one of the co-hosts on Accidental Tech Podcasts. Any tech fans who hear that, those two got together. It was one of the launch shows with Relay FM last year, and they took it in a completely different direction. Believe it or not, they talk about feelings, and feelings around their internet life, about being internet personalities, about dealing with things like working from home, dealing with things like Casey had a baby last year. Mike Hurley left his day job to go full-time with the podcasting network, Relay FM. They talked a lot about what that process has been like. Talked a lot about Twitter interactions and social interactions and dealing with, people who may treat you unfairly online. And they cover all kinds of different subjects. You talk about travel and things that basically have come up in the week and sort of how they've processed that, either as new business entrepreneurs or new fathers or just internet personalities and everything in between that. A whole section on online dating and what their opinions were on that. It's a really interesting show to be a part of a tech network like Relay FM that really kind of goes after things at a different angle. I'm a big fan of both Mike and Casey, and so if this sounded interesting to you in any way, I highly recommend check out Analog on Relay FM.
Absolutely.
So, Devon, you got another one for me?
Oh, I got tons of them. One show, and we've actually featured a review on our site of this show, and we're very enthusiastic about it, is a show called Millennial. It is by a producer out of Portland, Maine, which is, by the way, a lovely city if you've never been. And it's called Millennial, and her name is Megan Tan. And what she's doing, it's serialized, which we love, and we wish more shows were serialized, although it's a little difficult. But it is the experience of being a 20-something in 2015 and trying to negotiate that. And that might mean that you're dealing with money problems. It might mean that you're dealing with career problems, relationship things, family, whatever it is. And I know many of your listeners are probably not 20-something, and that might not sound like it would be in their wheelhouse. But trust me, it's in everyone's wheelhouse. It's wonderfully done. She's incredibly likable. She clearly puts a ton of time into each show, and everyone can identify with it. It's called Millennial, but it's really just the experience of learning how to live in the world and navigate these things. And especially as a creative type that's trying to pursue their dreams and maybe not looking around and seeing manifestations of success in their life, but nonetheless having a hunch that they should be doing what they're doing. And for her, it's pursuing a life in radio, and she should be doing it because her show is incredible. But it's really fun to follow the process with her. So I would highly recommend your readers check that out. Millennial by Megan Tan.
You're blowing up my subscription list here, Devon. I'm just getting more and more stuff here. That sounds super interesting. And
Maybe we should share the load a little.
I'm telling you, you'd be surprised. I think there's, based on a lot of the interactions I have with Twitter, there's a lot of 20-somethings, I think, listening to this show right now. So I think they may find it interesting, and I hope that they do. All right, I've got another one for you, too, and this one's really left field. I'm actually kind of great it's coming up in this particular forum because I don't know that I would necessarily even know who to reach out to for this particular show in terms of a guest. This one hit me completely out of left field. So as you know, and a lot of folks listening probably know, podcasting is exploding, right? And there's a lot of groups and enterprises and people trying to figure out how to get their hands in the podcasting game, produce something for themselves, so that, some people may have a website, they may have a magazine, they may have an email newsletter, and now people are starting to look at podcasts and kind of add that to their arsenal. Well, I think that was probably the original motivation of this show. So I was a little hesitant to check it out, but it came up on a recommended list, and I checked it out, and it has immediately shot towards the top of some of my favorite shows out there. And it is a product and a company. It's called Slack Variety Pack.
Oh my God, that was the longest preface. I was dying to know what it was.
It is Slack. If you're not familiar with what Slack is, it's basically a enterprise level instant messenger replacement. It's an app, it's a website, and so on and so forth. And it's been exploding, especially in the tech industry, in terms of people using Slack for communication, especially with companies that are in disparate locations. So if you're working remotely with colleagues and things like that, almost everybody's jumping on Slack nowadays as opposed to texting or email or anything like that. So they're really gaining a lot of traction. And they put together this podcast called Slack Variety Pack. It has astounding production value, guys. Sound, on-the-street interviews, and studio interviews, all kinds of production, sampling, and it's like 22 minutes. They've only had 5 episodes out at the time of this recording. It looks like they're about every 2 weeks or so. Take a chance and listen to it because I think it's going to blow your mind with what you're hearing, especially what you might think is a promotional podcast, and it's not. I mean, the most recent episode talked about elevator interactions and how people treat strangers on an elevator. And they gave this guy a microphone, the reporter, and he's kind of interviewing people like, hey, I just got on here. Can you tell me why you just moved to the corner then? And the people are like, no, I don't want to talk to you. And really interesting stuff. Interviews with a great organization, the story of the woman who found Black Girls Code, which has been around for years, and they've had scholarships, and they're sending people to school teaching young African-American girls on how to code software. And they interviewed her and talked about what she has grown and what she's developed. And this is not an ad for the company at all. It's actually a really good podcast. And you see this in your list, or you see this in the recommendation section of iTunes or your podcast app. You may never click on this because you think it's a promotional deal. Take a chance on it. Slack Variety Pack is that show.
That was a hell of a pitch.
Yeah. I'm looking for sponsors, Devon. Come on, bring them on.
Come on, Slack. Come on board.
That's my second one. You have another one?
I do. The third show is a show out of Vermont by a producer named Erica Heilman, and she is basically featuring stories from Vermont. And that doesn't mean it's all covered bridges and maple syrup. It is stories of just different people that you might meet there. And for instance, she interviewed a hairdresser that's a Vietnam vet. That was just a tremendous story of his experience, both going to war, coming back, acclimating, why he ended up becoming a barber. Just incredibly powerful tape. Her most recent episode, which we featured as a Best in Show this past week, is an interview with a homeless man, or I should say an occasionally homeless man. He's been in and out of houses and been occasionally homeless over the past several decades. And it was one of the most intense and personal and poignant interviews. And what I love about her show is she always keeps it interview style. So she doesn't edit herself out and just stitch together their tape, but it's a conversation. And the reason why I think that really works on her show is because both she's a provocative personality, she's smart, she's interesting, but it adds another layer of tension where you're not just hearing the homeless man and his interesting story. You're hearing the woman who is, I don't want to say she's privileged, but she's privileged in the sense that she has a home, figure out how to talk to a homeless person. And that's it's a fascinating discussion that we don't usually get to be privy to. And she's thoughtful, but she's occasionally awkward in trying to find the right words. And it's just, you get to be a fly on the wall in a wonderful way. And you never know what you're going to get with her show, ever. She's all over the map, but it is consistently excellent. And she's just a phenomenally talented producer that is on her way to, I hope, on her way to being a podcast household name. I won't say a household name, but a podcast household name. Erica Heilman, and that's Rumble Strip, Vermont.
That link will also be in the show notes as well. And I guess that means I've got to come up with one more as well. We'll make it even 3-3. But I'm going to make this one actually extraordinarily quick. The reason is because this is a excellent show that many of you have probably heard of, but I want to highlight one particular episode that literally blew my mind, and that's Radio Diaries. I was just looking through to make sure I've not talked about them before, but for some strange reason, I haven't. Radio Diaries has been a staple of mine for a very long time, and back on June 5th, they replayed an episode that apparently they had either recorded or broadcast years ago or under a different name or whatever the case may be, because this is coming up as episode 35, released on June 5th, and that's an episode called Matthew and the Judge. This episode is absolutely insane. I don't want to give away too much what it's about, but it's about a young person who faced some bad choices, made some bad decisions, went through the court system, and somehow, this was in the mid to late 90s, they gave both the kid and the judge recorders. Personal handheld recorders, and they were recording their thoughts all through the process. Shockingly crazy, interesting story, and at the end of it, you will be moved, for lack of a better term. I literally sent it to my kids and made them listen to this, and they were like, wow. It's that type of episode. That came out, and I think it was a re-release. It's only 20 minutes long, guys. It came out June 5th, episode 35 of Radio Diaries. Check it out. I promise you, you will love this one. So I'm going to make that, and their whole catalog's great, but I'm going to make that my third recommendation as well.
That's a really excellent episode. I think we featured that on
Did
our
you?
I'm pretty sure we did. It's really wonderful, and I will absolutely echo that. Radio Diaries is probably one of those shows that, because it's fairly popular, it's on the Radiotopia network, it's less likely to be talked about because we assume people know it.
Right.
But it's just wonderful. It's a wonderful show.
I am a huge fan of all things Radiotopia. I mean, I've had 2 or 3 of their hosts on with me already now. I love everything they're doing, and like you said, so many. I think I've had 3. I've had Helen Zaltzman, I've had Phoebe Judge, and I've had Dave Nadelberg from Mortified. There are so many great shows. If you are a brand new podcast listener, first of all, why are you subscribed to my show first before so many of these other great ones? But boy, if you want to just like double or triple your catalog right off the bat, checking out Radiotopia and just hitting subscribe is a great place to start, because wow, as so many things they're doing are excellent. And to Devon's point, some of those, especially because they've grown a lot over the last 6 to 12 months, I worry something like Radio Diaries doesn't get called out as much as it should, because holy mackerel, that and The Truth, which are 2 shows that I've not, I have mentioned The Truth before, but I've not conducted interviews with either host, although I'd love to, but those are 2 excellent shows as well.
Hey, you just snuck in a 4th.
I did, didn't I? I apologize.
You one-upper.
All right, so thank you very much for joining me this week. Thank you for taking the time, and before we go, though, tell everybody about all this great work you're doing online.
You can find us at thetimbre.com. That's www.thetimbre.com. You can find us on Twitter at Timbre Tweet, and you can find us on Facebook I'm not actually sure what our Facebook address is, but I'm sure if you Google or if you Facebook search the Timbre, you will find us. And we would love for you to stop by. And Dan, it was truly my pleasure to be on your show. I think we're kindred spirits in this whole enterprise, and I love the work you're doing. And it was, I was honored to be on the show. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words as well, Devon. Devon Taylor from thetimbre.com. All the links we mentioned, folks, are going to be in the show notes. There are going to be a lot of them, a lot of great shows we mentioned. And, folks, I know you're oftentimes sitting at that work computer with nothing to look at. Pull up a tab with Devon and Eric's website, and I think you're going to find a lot of great stuff, especially if you are a big podcast fan like us. For episode 50... thank you guys very much for listening. The first 50 episodes have been so much fun. I've got a lot of great stuff in store for you in the next 50 as well, working on the 1-year anniversary show. We'll see what I come up with. Got to figure out what I want to do first. But folks, thank you again so much for listening. If you've enjoyed what you heard, take just a minute, if you would. Click some stars on Stitcher or write a review in iTunes. I would greatly appreciate it. For episode 50, thank you guys very much for listening to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at Pod Digest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.